All right, well, thank you all for coming. This panel is part of an initiative called Best Practices. And the idea of best practices is to promote more conversation between industry professionals, writers, directors, producers, commissioners, broadcasters, talking about what we do, all aspects of what we do. And the idea is that the more we talk to each other and the more we learn from each other, the better we'll be at our jobs and the more we'll improve the general quality of the industry. And that this information should be freely available to anybody. So anybody wanting to join the industry or advance in the industry, wherever in the world you are, has access to this kind of expertise. And so for this inaugural Zoom session, I am so proud to be hosting these brilliant producers, commissioners, and writers on this call, beginning with Caroline Benjo from France, Oecourt. She's one of the most distinguished producers in France. Where shall I go next? Sara Collins, the brilliant British writer. Luisa Cotta Ramosino from Netflix, Italy, who I've had the pleasure of working with on several shows as a producer and is now commissioner at Netflix. And Jenna Robbins, brilliant development producer at HBO in the US, who I've also had the pleasure of working with. And so because I know all these people, I know how brilliant they are and how eager I am to hear their opinions about how best to give notes with writers. So I'm going to ask them a bunch of questions for a while, but also all of you who are listening to this panel, please feel free to type in questions, and I will be able to see the questions you're typing in and start asking your questions as well, which I'll probably do toward the second half of this Zoom call. So we only have an hour, and I feel like we could talk about this for many hours, but I'd like to start, if I may, by sort of talking about, if you could just in general terms, each of you talk about the writer relationship, the writer-producer or writer-broadcaster relationship in each of your territories, because very deliberately, we've chosen 4 different territories here. We have France, we have Italy, we have the United States, and the United Kingdom. So, Luisa, can I just start with you? And can you talk about how it works in Italy? Because you've been both a producer and now you're a commissioner with Netflix.
Yes, sure. And I think it's a particular situation, and my experience can help explain why it's specific to Italy. Because in the position I am now as a commissioner, we work, we consider partner first the production company, and the production company is the one who manage directly the relationship with the writers. Whereas when I used to be a producer, and I had this direct, and I wouldn't say daily relationship with writers when I was working with them, but maybe Frank would say, yes, it was daily and it was a bit too much, but anyway. And I think when I changed my job and I went from being a producer to being a commissioner, this changed a bit the perspective, because obviously the center of our work is still the content, is still developing scripts, but when you have to deal directly with the writer, and in a way, I'm still doing it because I have meeting with writers, I give notes to writers, but with this sort of triangle of relationship with the producer is slightly different. I think any different commissioner in Italy is slightly different, because this is the way Netflix Italy works with creatives. Rai, that is a public broadcaster, is slightly different, or Mediaset or Sky. So it's not exactly the same, but I think Italy is an industry where the producer is central to the process. So also a show is obviously created by a writer, but in a sense, the contribution to a producer is critical to the final definition of the show, much more, I suppose, than in other countries. And so the producer is always in all the conversation, and is part of development process a lot.
Caroline, would you say it's similar in France?
Yes, I will say it's definitely similar, and I really appreciated what you said about how important the producer is for you, because it's not always the same in every country. And basically, we think this triangle, a commissioner, producer, writer, creator, is absolutely essential because it creates a dialectic, a dynamic that has an enormous value. And what, depending the moment you speak to such or such person, it just, you can add a different perspective, a different angle. And we all know in France that, especially when we developed a very strong relationship with some commissioners, that we have exactly the same way of viewing the project we develop. We know what role to play vis-a-vis the writer. We know who has to be the bad guy and the good guy at the right moment, because there is always a moment, of course, when everything is okay, there is no problem. But there are many stressful moments in the writing, and this is where it's very interesting to work hand in hand with the commissioner and the broadcaster to find the way to speak to a writer, to provoke the right reaction, and to have this person find the right tool to fix problems. I have to say also that there is a bit of a difference depending the kind of writer you work with, because I mean, we have had in France a very close relationship with the writing process, with many author directors, you know, that were doing both writer directors, and that for a long time didn't work with commissioners and for TV like you used to in the UK or in the US. And basically, it brought someone else into the conversation that we didn't used to have for many, many years, where basically this was not happening the way it was happening in other country. And many writers had to learn this way of listening, not only to the producer, but also to the need of the commissioners and of the broadcaster. And I have to say, I think it enriched a lot the relationship we could have around the development. I like, as far as I am concerned, to be on the side of the writer and on the commissioner, depending the moment of the development. And my role is to balance both moments.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So Jenna, in the US, I'm imagining sometimes you have a producer and sometimes you don't. Sometimes it's you and
Yeah, I
them.
think the US is a little bit different based on what you all are saying, and also based on some of my experiences working on international co-productions. I think in the US, the role of showrunner plays an enormous part, where the head writer of the show is also an executive producer and is basically running every aspect of production and the room, obviously, and every part of the show. And it's an interesting system because not everyone who's fantastic on the page and a fantastic writer is also great as at managing a huge cast and crew of people, but the ones who are end up becoming incredibly powerful writers in the Hollywood television system. So I think for us, we love producers, we love working with them, but our relationships are usually first and foremost with the writers directly. And you know, the producers are incredibly important to the process, but we have a lot of shows where we just start with a writer and then we add producers later. And I think especially at HBO, we are incredibly hands-on with the writers, possibly different than some of the other networks in the US. Just the way that my department operates is, you know, we talk to writers constantly all day, every day. We are really in there with them from the beginning, which we find to be a really great process, but it can get more complicated, more contentious when you're, you know, talking directly to writers and you don't necessarily have that sort of balancing force of a producer to go through. But at the end of the day, that's the way we prefer to work.
And Sara, have you always worked with a producer, and do you value that? If so, like that, having that third voice in the room?
I mean, as I was listening to everyone else, I was thinking I work almost exclusively with producers. There were a couple of commissioners with whom I've I've had projects, and you sort of develop the relationship in the course of getting the thing made that survives that relationship. But generally, it's all producers. As a result of which, I think I've sort of received this idea that producers are incredibly central to the whole process, probably fed to me by the producers themselves. But when I talk with my UK writer friends, we are very jealous of the American showrunner model. And it also occurred to me when I was listening to everyone else speak that the shows that I have liked the best coming out of the UK in recent years and that have done phenomenally well and translated internationally have kind of informally adopted that model. So I'm thinking of Phoebe Waller-Bridge with Fleabag, and Michaela Cole with I May Destroy You, and Candice Carty-Williams with Queenie and the other stuff she's doing. I get the sense that there is a sort of push towards a hybrid kind of role for writers in the UK. And I'm not sure where that's coming from. But I think as a result, the writers who are working in that kind of vein are having more direct contact with commissioners, and anecdotally, I think it's working quite well for them.
I'd like to get really, really specific with each of you about how you give notes. Because I'm an American, but I've been a British producer now for 11 years. And so I'm still writing, but I'm also reading lots of scripts that I'm not writing. Now, for me, when I get a new script to read, I'm excited, but I'm also very, very slow. And if I have a lot of notes, it takes me hours to get through reading the script. Could each of you, in any order, just talk about literally what you do? And do you print out the script? Do you make notes on the script? Do you read it first without making any notes and then make notes? And then do you talk to any other colleagues? Can you just sort of talk about literally what that process is like? Let's say it's the first draft of a script. Anybody who wants to go?
I can go if you want.
Sure.
And I think that having the first draft of a script is always exciting and scaring at the same time, because you desperately want it to be perfect and already something and to be excited. It's not always the case, but still I think that I keep this kind of excitement when I receive a script, and it's a good thing because it's the best you can give your whole attention and focus to a script. And usually I try to read the first time without taking notes, just to try to preserve this sense of I'm reading it, I want to just turn the page right to the end, I'm interested in the characters, like when I first watch a cat, this kind of experience that is free from every kind of judgment. So right in the end, this is the perfect version of it, not always possible, but this is what I try. Then I take a moment, think about it, and after, let's say, 2 hours, go back to the script and reread, writing notes. I like to print my scripts and have them in paper to be able to write. I'm not always able to read my own writing later, but I think it's something that forces you to be concrete in what you write and you think. And then the third time is when I actually write the note on my computer, because I go through the scripts. First, I put main ideas I want to explore in the note, especially if the first draft. I don't think it makes sense to go in details of the scenes. It's more about structure than about a specific scene or a specific dialogue that doesn't make sense at this stage. So I try to have a discipline of writing a series of bullet points I want to have in the notes, just to give them an order, and then develop all the points in the document by layers. And one thing, probably when I used to be a creative, and I was sure in the following days, I was able to have a conversation with the writers. Maybe I was a bit more essential in the notes because I took for granted that a conversation will follow and I could develop more my thoughts. Now that I am a commissioner and I know that this direct conversation might be short because of time, might be not immediate, might go through the producer and other people, I try to be extra clear, not extra long, because I think being long doesn't mean that you are more clear than being short. and then try and have a meeting as soon as possible to go through the notes. Usually I try to send the notes before the meeting because I think that is better for the writer to have an idea, general idea of the main points, and then discuss them maybe already with some ideas to solve or address the notes, maybe not, maybe it's just I don't understand this note, that this could be, but I think this is my process usually.
Great. Caroline, Jenna?
Yeah, I can jump in. I follow a pretty similar process. I usually try to read something for the first time without making any notes, but oftentimes something comes up that I don't want to forget, so I'll write myself a separate note so that I have it written down. But I do like the philosophy of reading the script for the first time without thinking too hard about the notes, just to sort of get that experience of what it would be like watching it as an audience member. And then I usually go back and read it in much greater detail. We try to work in teams here at HBO because we like to have sort of a dialogue internally in terms of what we're thinking about the show before we go to the writers. And I think it's incredibly helpful to talk things out with sort of an internal party and see if you guys are feeling the same way about it. If the same notes are coming up for everyone involved, then it's definitely a note that you should give. So there's usually an internal dialogue back and forth before anything goes out to the writer and the producers. We often do send written notes in advance of a phone call. Sometimes we wait and talk about it first and then send them afterwards. It depends sort of on what we think the particular writer will benefit from. If we think it's better to sort of talk it out first and then follow up with the results of the conversation, or if we want them to have something to respond to. And sometimes it's just sort of like where we are in the process. If we want to get on the phone quickly and don't want to, spend a long time polishing up the notes to send out. So it really depends, but we usually do both a combination of a written document and a phone call or Zoom or in-person meeting, even depending on whether or not everyone's local and sort of like what stage the project is in. But there's definitely a lot of like sort of sitting with the show and the reflecting back on it and on the script and trying to think of sort of what's bumping for me and then how to communicate that in a constructive way to the writer.
Caroline?
Well, I agree that the first impression is so incredibly important because when I read a script for the first time, I want to forget that I am a producer. I want to be a viewer. I want to imagine that I'm in front of a screen and watching this story. So I think even if it's not thought out very precisely, I really love the first impression. And when I finish reading the script, this first impression is the first thing I'm going to write down to try to be as specific as possible about what I felt was very positive, moving or not working at all. So this is getting out as fast as possible. And after coming back and getting into more specific written notes on the script, I actually read on my computer and do notes beside, on my screen, trying to be as specific as possible if it's useful to be, because it depends entirely at what stage you read the script. Sometimes to get very specific on the first draft doesn't make any sense because you know that things are going to change and you rather concentrate on the most important point and topics. I have to add, as you, Jenna, that I am working very closely to a young head of development who are working with me, a man and a woman. I have two very different points of view. They have great taste, but different taste. And I love how we can contradict each other and try to find out what will be actually the most important thing to convey to the writer. And as far as sending notes or speaking to the writer first, I have to say it depends entirely on what you have to say, because if things are very negative, it's much better to be able to talk first, because there is nothing, and I have experienced it in my life, where sometimes you don't have the time to speak with the writer and you send the notes and they're a bit critical. The effect it produces is tremendously negative, when in fact, when you read the notes after, you think, well, this is not that negative. But if it's the first reaction you have to a script, that could be really painful. So what we try to do in that case is first to speak with the writer, and what is very interesting is whatever notes you wrote, if you don't send them and speak with the writer, you will change your notes before to send them, because clearly the back and forth with the writer is going to make you think differently about not only the criticism you have to make, but also what is going wrong in the script you've read.
So Sara, as the writer receiving these notes, can you talk a little bit about like the kinds of notes that in your experience have been really helpful, or some kinds of notes that have been less helpful to you?
Sure. I actually do want to say something before then, though, about how the notes are delivered, because for me, it is always essential to have a conversation first, and that's whether the news is negative or positive. It is such a psychological process for the writer, the receiving of notes. And it's as important, perhaps more important for the writer than anyone else involved in the process, to sustain your level of excitement and enthusiasm about the project. And I find that, you know, you've hopefully, if you've done your job well, you have really poured your own sort of subconscious into this draft. It's not just about craft, it's about mining your soul and your perspective on the world for something. And so you've really gone deep and gone through a process that can be quite taxing emotionally and spiritually in some ways. And I think to be met after that with just a wall of text, you know, an anonymous wall of text, can be a bit demoralizing. And that's whether the notes are good or bad. I have found actually that notes for me work best when they are discussed first, because also they develop. The discussion of notes, in particular in response to the first draft, is such a useful collaborative process. The notes never stay the same as they would have done if you'd just been delivered them in a letter or an email. It's so useful to talk through what is meant by a note and what your response to it is, and developing a kind of solution together. For me, that's the most electric part of the process. And I think the next draft would be missing some of that electricity if that hadn't been done first. That's my perspective. So it was really interesting for me to hear sort of almost universally that there's a kind of preference to deliver notes in writing first. I think for me, I mean, you can also tell on the other side of the table that there's a little bit of a practice that's developed, you know, writer management, I call it. So you're going to get the good news first. There's always going to be some kind of positive reaction to sweeten the bitter pill that you've got to swallow. But for me, the notes that really work best, and I think Caroline alluded to this, are the ones that are as specific as you need them to be. And that is a real producer's skill. Some producers are so good at knowing how to deliver the kind of high level, detailed, specific feedback you need without stepping all over the writer's role in the process, so without rewriting the thing. So it's specific, but not too specific. Also, I find notes work really well when they are divided into categories. So, you know, you're talking about characterization. Are there issues with characterization? You know, you're talking about arcs. Are there issues with story arcs or character arcs? You know, you're talking about structure. Is there an issue with structure or pacing? And then as a writer, when you're doing your passes, because I like to do passes thinking about those things in isolation and then the script as a whole, you've already got that sort of organization done for you as an organic result of the notes process. I also think that it's really helpful to give notes that don't push writers into a corner. So, you know, writers are going to feel defensive about criticism, and they're going to feel like they need to sort of, you know, even though the best practice for writers is stay quiet, absorb what you're being told, even if you want to say, no, you don't know what the hell you're talking about, bite your tongue. It's really helpful, I think, for producers to bear that in mind when delivering the notes. So deliver them in a way that can't easily spark that kind of reaction. And by that, I mean, there are some producers that are so good at extending a hand over the notes table. So it's not about telling someone this is what's wrong with your script. It's about saying, I wonder if we could think about X and Y for characterization with this particular character. And have you thought about, and what about these comps that I'm bringing to the table? And I always think those are the producers that have had some writing experience themselves. So it feels like they've identified the problem for you, but you're somehow solving the problem together. That kind of notes process can be really galvanizing and can send you back to the next draft in the process with real enthusiasm. And I think ultimately that's the producer's sort of big job for me. When you're in a notes meeting, you want to leave it feeling good about the job. Like, yeah, I want to get back to this. I can't wait to get back to this. You know, I'm going to knock it out of the park because I've been given not just a pep talk, but a roadmap and a kind of hand to hold, metaphorical hand to hold throughout the process. And that's a sort of combination of the psychological and the professional, isn't it?
Absolutely. Well said. For the rest of you on the other side of this process, I'm wondering if you ever feel like I need to limit the number of notes I'm giving so that it's not overwhelming for the writer. And where do you draw the line in terms of here's the problem, but also here's a solution? Do you stop yourself from actually offering a solution because you feel like you're stepping over, doing the writer's job then? Like, how do you make those kinds of judgments?
Colleague of mine told me that our job is really to reflect the writer's vision back to them. And so I think that that's sort of the philosophy that I try to take when I'm deciding what notes to give and what notes would be helpful in any situation, is not to necessarily take my own vision of what I think the show could or should be, but instead to think about why we bought it and what we were talking about when we were discussing the show from the start, and how to bring that forward in the writer's work. And so I think that when you're approaching it from that lens, it's more about, you've said that the show is supposed to be representative of this. We're not quite sure that it's coming through in these ways. Like, here's some suggestions of where you might consider bringing things forward or changing things. So I think that and that tends to get us a process that's the writers are a little bit more receptive to, because it feels like we're not trying to change the vision that they've put forth. Instead, we're trying to embrace it and bring it forward. In terms of like the amount of notes that you give, I think it depends on where you are process-wise and how much work something needs. I think that if something really isn't working, you really just focus on the big problem areas, like the high level, like structure, theme, concept. And if you're about to go into production, I give as many notes as I have. If the closer we're getting to actually shooting something, the more that I'm just going to put it all out there, because, at a certain point, it's being filmed, and the changes are much harder to make in post-production. But when we're starting with development, I keep it high level and then get more detailed as we go on, always sort of in service of the vision that we were working towards at the beginning.
I would say it's the same for me, because I think for sure I don't want to give answer and more ask questions to writers. And I think that the word that Jenna used, vision, is key, because as in a sense I'm giving not to the writers, but also to a producer, who is the one who is working with me in preserving the vision. I want to be sure to have on board both of them, because they are the one who are working to deliver what I need. So alignment about the vision is part of a job of a meeting usually. So the first in a meeting, I usually like to talk about it. So where we are with the show, so we can, and once we all agree on the vision and we still are on the same side on this, we can discuss the details or the general questions about the show if we are at the beginning. And I think, and I agree, it's always better to start with structural problem if you have structural problem, because and I think this is easy to understand. If you start with the details, also the writers is going to solve the details and maybe don't address the structure, because it's usually, and Sara, correct me if I'm wrong, usually solving a detailed problem is more easy than solve a structural problem. So if you start and put a series of details on notes when there is a big structural problem, it doesn't mean anything, and it's not useful, nor for me or the writers or the producer. So I think create an order on what you need in the process, I think, is the first thing I try to do. And I think maybe it was wrong, but when I used to be a producer, I was more willing to give also maybe possible answers, but always like a possibility, because I think I had this kind of trust with the writers, this kind of daily kind of conversation with them. So this was perceived not as a prescription, but as an idea put on the table, a sort of brainstorming. When you are a commissioner, you can't do this, because any kind of prescription is not something that you can discuss in detail. So maybe it's a brilliant idea, or maybe it's not. And if the writer feels as is pushed and forced in using exactly this kind of solution, this is going to make the process even more muddy than it is at the moment. So you have more problems and you have solutions. So I think on the side of a commissioner, you should probably be more disciplined in asking questions and trying to get back to the vision you bought at the beginning.
Caroline, as the producer, do you feel like you're sort of between the broadcaster and the writer, like trying to figure out how to get the writer to deliver what the broadcaster wants, or how to get the broadcaster to move closer to what the writer is trying to say?
What I love, as I was saying as a start, is constantly both ways. I have to represent as much the writer as I have to represent the broadcaster. And you know, I come from the movie business originally, where it is very different, because you finance your film and after you don't have anybody in front of you but the writer director. And what I loved when I started producing the TV, and I keep producing film, so I go, you know, from one to the other way of doing, is that I am with the writer in front of the broadcaster and with the broadcaster in front of the writer. And I found that, again, it's enriching a lot the ultimate result and what we can come up with, because there is nothing more exciting than to be exchanging with a broadcaster that knows the writing, knows the process, is in love with what it has or she has picked. And basically, you are constantly, I'm generally very much encouraged by the broadcaster feedback. I have to say that the process of notes, depending on we have been working with very different countries, and there is a tradition of very long notes. What I'm a bit disturbed with is when you get further and further into the development and the notes become longer and longer, when the script is obviously better and better. And at some point, I understand the need to keep coming back on what you are doing constantly. But I think there is something in TV that we tend to forget a bit, and we never forget in cinema. It's that ultimately a script is supposed to be put on screen, directed. And there are many things that every problem that you have in the writing will never be resolved through the directing. And this, I totally agree. I think we have to get the best script possible. But there are many situations that need to, and that's why the role of the director is essential. And we bring the director usually very early on to be capable of putting his vision, of sharing it with the writer and the creator. Because for me, directing is in the writing. And this is something that we are very keen on imposing, which is not often easy because the practices are extremely different, is to have constantly in mind that the last thing that is going to be done is directing. And you know, François Truffaut was having this great sentence that basically directing was always going against the writing, and editing was always going against the directing. And I think it's a movement, and sometimes it's a global movement, all those elements, and the editing is essential because the editing is coming back to the writing process in some ways. So I will say that the absolute focus on the writing is something essential, which has made the best, series that we all love. But I think we should really emphasize what there is to come after as essential elements of the process.
Mm-hmm. Sara, what do you do if you get bad notes or notes that you just fundamentally disagree with? How do you handle that?
I mean, I think I alluded earlier to the idea that it's important to stay quiet, to sort of fight your initial reaction. I don't know if this comes from a kind of writing workshop discipline, but there is a discipline in writing workshops when you're receiving notes on the work you've submitted for the workshop, that you do not respond. And so you've got to develop the skill, and it is a skill, of sitting and listening to your work being critiqued without immediately becoming defensive about it. I think that's so important, because if you jump to defensiveness, you will miss whatever there is in the note that's of value. And I think for me, the golden rule is that even a bad note will have something of value if you allow yourself to assimilate it. And so that's the first thing. Stay quiet. Like, it's not your job when the note's being given to immediately jump to arguing about it. Listen, assimilate, and process. So I have a rule for myself that I never reject a note out of hand in a meeting. This will make me very popular with producers, I know. There are ways, just like writers are managed, this is another tip, which you guys probably are aware of, producers are also managed. You know, writers have ways of managing producers. And one of the things is, that's really interesting, or I'll try it, or let me think about that. And those are all good strategies for what you want to do is put a pause on something, especially if it has really horrified you, especially if you think this is driving a coach and horses through what I'm trying to do. The best thing you can do in that moment is say, let me try it, or let me think about it. And so I do have a rule. I don't just say, let me try it. I go away, I think about the note, I think about whether there was anything of value in it, and I do try it in some way or another. We're working on something at the moment, Frank. It wasn't a bad note, by the way. I think it was something I came up with, where I went away and tried it and it didn't work. And I've come back on the second draft and said, actually, I don't think that worked. What do you guys think? And so I think that is always a good strategy with a bad note. Buy yourself some time. Another good one is question it. So, you know, turn it back on the person giving the note. What do you mean by that? How do you think we can fit that in? How do you think it works with such and such? Sometimes if you point out that it's going to completely contradict something else that's really important to the vision, that's enough to kill it. But interrogate it only after you've taken time to think about it. And usually, I think, if you follow that kind of stay quiet, assimilate, try, interrogate, you come up with a compromise that squeezes whatever value there is out of the note, and you can use it to your advantage. And if not, at least you haven't pissed the producers off in the process.
Right. But you would never do a note that you don't agree with, or that you think is
you know, that's a really good point. I mean, it is such a delicate balance. I wouldn't, and I have had to stand up for the project. And I always think of it as standing up for the project and not myself. It is not personal. But if you are writing something and it means something to you, it becomes a kind of almost living being in the world that you are responsible for gestating, giving birth to, and making sure it sort of grows up and does well. And so you do want to think of it as protecting the integrity of the project. If something is a note that is really going to violate that, then you have to be prepared to say, I don't think this is going to work, and this isn't my vision for it, so our visions might not align. But I think you also have to choose those battles. You can't do that with every bad note, because not every bad note is going to violate the integrity of the project. I think one of the most important skills and jobs for a writer is to understand where it's necessary really to go to bat for the integrity of the thing, and where you can afford to compromise during this process.
I wonder if that metaphor, you know, thinking of the script as like a living being, kind of resonates with everybody, because I do think as a producer or a commissioner, you have to have so much emotional intelligence in the way you communicate notes to a writer. And if you're in a contentious note session, just your posture in that session, the way you're talking about the material versus the person sitting in front of you, right? It is like another thing. It's right. It's this thing outside of all of you that you're all serving together. Is that the way you look at it, or how do you approach that? Like, always saying something positive to the writer first, I always think is sort of making the writer feel safe first before you come at them with the the bad
But
bit.
it's a real skill, actually, to start saying something positive that doesn't look like you are protecting the writer from what there is to come.
Yeah.
I have to say that depending on the culture, we are more or less talented at that. You know, the Brits and the Americans are astonishing at that. Every time I want to learn, I say, my God, how do they do that? But there are some culture who are so incredibly blunt, you know. I mean, depending if you work with Nordic Germans, I mean, this seems to be a bit archetypal, but I swear it is the case. And I know that in France, we are very blunt. And that's something that is quite amazing. When you work with different culture, you really have to adapt. And depending the nationality of the writer you work with, you have to adapt to and be extremely careful. Well, this is something that is very exciting too. And I agree, Frank, I'd love to be, you know, I mean, Zoom has, unfortunately, and we're forced to it because of the COVID times, but has changed a lot the relationship you have to a writer, because there is not anymore this kind of body language, this presence that you feel, that something is very intuitive and you know, goes through the senses and not through the brain. You know exactly what's going on in the room. Zoom has changed a bit that perception of things during a meeting, and I have to say that nothing replaces the fact of being in front of a writer and adapting to how this person is and is going to react to what you are going to say. Because you could also, in the middle of something, decide that agree on the fact that you were absolutely wrong, you know, and feel that you better say that you were wrong, even if sometimes you were right. And I think it's not a game you play, it's just that at some point you feel that you have to you have to leave some more space, you know, you have to let it go.
But,
and on Zoom, it is much tougher to feel things like that.
What I hear from all of you is this implicit respect for the writer and this sort of sense of, you know, you need to figure out how to harness the writer's talents and enthusiasm, which is not always the case. I mean, there are some cultures, as you said, Caroline, where the writer is just there to sort of take orders, like, you will do this. I've literally seen notes that are, you will do this, right? But you would, I think I'm speaking for all of you when you say, like, you would never do that because you want to inspire the writer to do their best work.
I think so, because if you want a creative person do a creative work, the thing that you want to ask them is not to just obey an order, because it's a less probable way to obtain something interesting and new and surprising. Maybe the solution is not what you had in mind, and if you prescribe something, usually, even if you receive what you asked for, usually you won't like it. Or at least, so for me, it happened many times when I made the mistake of asking something specific. When I received the following draft of the script, I said to myself, it's not because they did it wrong. It's probably, it was wrong to ask them to do precisely what I had in mind. That was not what they would find as a solution of my note. So I think it's never your answer, the answer. And the conversation, I think, is the key. And we try to go back to personal meeting in person as soon as possible in our office, exactly because of that, because realize that even the nicer set of notes given and discussed in Zoom or Meet or whatever you have, has not the same effect than a meeting in person. If you have, and take the time, spend the time with a person and get to know them, because you can realize that what they can give. And usually when you don't have just one writer, but a group of writers, that is usually my experience in the project I'm working with. Also, the balance in between the group of writers is important, and you can get it when you have them in a room and not when you see them in these little windows in the computer, because it's not the real dynamic of a group of writers.
Absolutely. Caroline, you were talking about directors, and we have a question from David. Like, what do you do if a writer is saying, we need to cut this? This is why we need to cut this. and the director is saying, that's my favorite part, it's working so well, we cannot possibly cut that. How do you negotiate like passionate differences of opinion creatively between writer and director if you're on a script?
Well, that I might not be very humble saying that, but I may have an opinion too, and I'm going to, basically trust what I feel is right. And if I feel one of the two is right, I will fight for this point of view, and certainly not because it is the writer or the director, but just because I think it's right for the show.
Very good. And here's another question. As a producer, how do you give a note to the writer that you receive from the broadcaster, but that you don't agree with and haven't been able to discuss with the broadcaster or persuade the broadcaster otherwise?
Well, if I really think it's a note that is going to hurt the show, again, I will not talk to the writer first. I will call the broadcaster and discuss why this note was written, and try to understand and maybe convince the broadcaster, or be convinced by the broadcaster that it's a useful note. And sometimes in some situations I have been fighting quite strongly to because I was sure the broadcaster was right, even if the the writer did not agree, but the other way around as well. I mean, I think what's difficult at some point is that the broadcaster will have the last say, and it's fair. This is how it works. But I think what I owe the broadcaster is to be as sincere as possible about what I feel, and be as convincing as possible. If I fail, ultimately the broadcaster will be the one deciding. But my job is not to fail, and to try to convince. Always convince.
What do you do if you have a writer, a writer who's very defensive and argumentative, the opposite of Sara, somebody who really every note is giving you pushback and your notes are valid? What do you do with a personality like that? I know you've all had that personality. You can't tell me you haven't. So what do you do with those people?
I think we probably end up not making the show.
It's just not going to work.
I mean, it depends. I mean, sometimes people have such an incredibly well-proven track record that you might give them like, okay, we'll do it your way and see how it goes, and you could be wrong. But I think, if you're working with a writer, especially who you don't have that kind of relationship with before, that this is the first time you're working with someone and they have that kind of lack of collaboration, then it probably won't be a relationship that works out in the end.
I mean, I have to say, as a writer as well, I don't think I'm uniquely amenable. I think what happens is I gravitate towards working with people where you can just tell when there is going to be a sort of symbiosis. It's almost like falling in love, from the first meeting with producers. Jenna talked about vision. If your vision's going to align. And I think if you find yourself becoming that antagonistic person in the room as the writer, it's not a project you should be in. It's just way too soul destroying. I wouldn't want to work that way. And I don't think you're going to generate good work if you're working with people that you feel you have to be fighting over every note.
I can say, Frank, that if you start a collaboration thinking that you are going to convince the other person to do the show you want to do, and the other person is thinking the same thing, sooner or later this is going to end bad. Because I think the show has to be something that is a collaborative work, not only in the writing, and then in all the other phases of this kind of process. And I think this point of view is valid also from the beginning. I can't buy a show already thinking that I'm going to change it drastically. And because if this is the case, I probably would be better not buying it.
Right. So
I think it's so important, the collaborative aspect of this work. I think it's so essential. And I was referring to producing movies. Very often I miss in movies this collaborative process of making a TV show. And usually, I mean, it's essential to work with writers that don't take personally note. You know, this is, I think, the most difficult for us, and I know for broadcaster as well, is when you criticize something in a script and the person reacts in a way that it seems you are criticizing the person who wrote it. I think it would be, you know, that's this, for me, it's really the biggest difference is at some point something is written and we are all working in the same direction, is to make the best show possible. And I love when a writer tells me, and I am embarrassed because I'm feeling something is wrong, and you know, I take a lot of precaution. And the writers say, look, the problem is we don't care. The point is that it's not working if you tell me you don't think it's working, and I have to find a solution. And what I love also is when the writers always come back with solution you did not expect.
Yeah.
And you know, when you were talking about commissioners wanting something specific and you not agreeing, what I love with the collaborative work with the writer is when they say, we'll find a solution, but we'll certainly not find it where you expect it to come from. And very often it's like on editing, you know, that the problem is not on what you are saying, it's on what happened before or what happened after. And I think the process of writing is the same thing. The solution are, a writer will always find a solution elsewhere, and this is what's so exciting. And in a collaborative process, it's more likely to happen than when someone is going to refuse to do anything because he feels personally or she feels personally wounded.
Absolutely.
No ego is essential.
So we have a question here that I think requires you to sort of back up in the process here, which is how and when can you make sure that you share the same vision? I guess this is speaking to before the script is even written. Is that right? I mean, would it be in discussion about the idea, like in the, I guess in Europe, often you're given written pages describing the series. In the US, it would be a verbal pitch. But how do you make sure you have the same vision from the beginning so you don't go down the wrong path?
I think often it goes all the way back to the pitch, and when we hear pitches, we ask a lot of questions at the end of them, and we really ask the writers about sort of like what they see the series taking on and where they expect it to go. And so I think that ends up being incredibly helpful in sort of telling you what the writer has in mind. Even if there's a written script already, we usually do some kind of conversation, verbal conversation, before we actually go in on something and meet the person who's writing it and the whole team, and have just sort of like a bigger conversation about what we envision the show being.
Mm-hmm.
In Italy, we usually receive a written concept and then the people come and talk about it and we can make questions. Sometimes they ask us to come and pitch the idea and then they send us the document, and this could be another option because as for the notes, we discuss the vision while we are talking, and sometimes they made their changes in the concept before sending it. I hope not changes that are going to change the vision they shared with us, but I think it's another way to start discussing it. I think it's the first moment when you discuss it. And maybe I think when you receive the first script, or what we receive usually is also a Bible of a series, large series outline, or whatever is the document we ask or we agree on. And I think at this moment it's useful to go back and verify together if this is coherent with the vision we shared at the beginning, or if and I think it was interesting, as a script is a sort of living being, so it's something that can change. So the vision has to be preserved, but not in a rigid way, because I think something can mature through the process, and is going back to, oh, you pitch this and it's not exactly what I receive, it doesn't make sense for me. So this range of changes that stays in the process of growing is okay. So it's good to align, but not being so rigid to say, oh, this was exactly what I bought, so I won't go back exactly to this point. That doesn't make sense.
I guess this goes for all of you. How do you avoid losing perspective as you go through the development process? Like, how do you keep reading draft after draft and kind of stay close to what it is you think is going to excite viewers who watch this show? Is there a trick to that?
Sometimes we ask for an outside opinion. Sometimes if I feel like I've lost perspective, we'll ask someone who's on our team who hasn't worked on the show to be like a completely fresh pair of eyes and tell us what they think, which can be incredibly helpful. If you've, been through a process and you know the writer so well, you know what they're going for, but you can't tell if you just know what it is, or if it's actually on the page. So we definitely pull in external people from our team to weigh in on a fairly regular basis.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it's important when you have the chance to have a team around you to be capable of bringing in people that will not have followed every step of the process and will not have gotten attached to, the story, the characters, that at some point you defend yourself in a bit excessive way as well. You need someone to have the distance you have lost. But I have to say that when over and over I read, I don't know how many drafts, and I get a kick out of them every time, I know that there is really something good. And usually, I want to trust the capacity some writers have to bring me over and over in the same state of excitement and wonder.
And what do you all do if you're feeling discouraged? If it's, and this could be for you too, Sara, but it's like, I'm not enjoying this, or I feel like we've lost it, or how do you get back on track?
I brought something over from novel writing, which, as you know, Frank, is my background, which I learned when writing a novel, which is every story has a live wire. For me, actually, the script writing process gets better and better the more drafts you do. The more drafts you do, the more excited you should become about something. Because what should be happening is that you're distilling it down to the thing that makes it real magic. And so the live wire for me is a mission statement for the story. Sometimes I have it, I've got all kinds of stuff stuck on the wall where I work. And sometimes it's, the mission statement for whatever I'm working on. Everything in the story has to touch the live wire in order to make sense. And if by the time you're on draft 5 or 6, the live wire is electrifying everything. For me, I think attitude is everything, that you have to love what you're doing as a writer. There is absolutely no point doing something that you feel like you're just a hack about. If you're sitting day after day, spending hours on something, you have to fall in love with it. And that way you will convince other people to fall in love with it as well. And it's all to do with the core, with the why are you telling this story? And you don't feel like giving up if you're being driven to write a story that you really think, I'm sorry, that's my bin alarm because I'm back in the UK. Because you really feel like this story has to be in the world, that it's saying something, and that it's a privilege that you've been given as a writer to be put in the position to say it, that it's going to actually make a difference, and that people are going to respond to it. For me, there's absolutely nothing better. And honestly, sometimes you think, wow, I'm getting paid for this as well. Mm-hmm. I think if you bring that sense of love to the process, and that idea that you're truly being given a gift in being given this sort of platform to tell stories and make a difference, that it helps when you reach those hurdles.
Beautifully said. Well, as I knew it would, the hour has flown by. We're already out of time, but thank you. That was really fantastic. I learned a lot. I'm sure many people on this call did as well. So once again, I'd just like to thank you, Sara, Luisa, Jenna, and Caroline, for being part of this conversation, and look forward to the next one.
That was a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks
a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.